March 17, 1943, 03:42 hours, North Atlantic Ocean, 430 nautical miles southwest of Iceland. Seaman First Class Tommy Patterson pressed his oil-stained hands against the freezing steel depth charge rack and watched the ocean trying to kill him. The USS Bory, a Gleaves-class destroyer displacing 1,630 tons, rolled through 30-foot swells in a storm that had been building for 16 hours. Water temperature was 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Air temperature was 26 degrees. Wind speed exceeded 40 knots, driving horizontal sheets of spray across the destroyer's fantail where Patterson stood with the depth charge crew. And somewhere beneath the black water, a German U-boat was stalking convoy HX-229, 38 merchant ships carrying 140,000 tons of war material from New York to Liverpool. Patterson was 22 years old, a former Ford truck mechanic from Detroit who had been in the Navy for exactly 7 months. His official rating was Seaman First Class, depth charge loader, but his actual job this morning was figuring out why the USS Bory's Mark VI depth charges kept failing to detonate at their preset depths. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Each depth charge contained 600 pounds of TNT in a cylindrical steel casing designed to sink at 8.5 feet per second and explode at preset depths between 50 and 300 feet. The hydrostatic pressure-activated detonator was a mechanical marvel. A spring-loaded firing pin held back by a diaphragm that would rupture at specific water pressures corresponding to specific depths. When the depth charge reached its preset depth, water pressure would overcome the spring tension, the diaphragm would rupture, the firing pin would strike the detonator, and 600 pounds of TNT would create a shockwave capable of crushing a U-boat's pressure hull from 30 feet away. Except the goddamn things weren't exploding. Patterson had watched the USS Bory's depth charge crew drop 43 depth charges in the past 6 days of convoy escort duty. Sonar operators reported hearing detonations for 13 of them. 30 depth charges, 18,000 pounds of high explosive, had simply sunk to the ocean floor without detonating. Wasted because something in the detonator mechanism was failing. Patterson knew exactly what was failing because he'd seen the same problem in Ford truck carburetors back in Detroit. Water was getting into the detonator spring housing through the inspection port seal, corroding the spring tension mechanism and preventing the firing pin from releasing, even when the diaphragm ruptured at the correct depth. The solution was absurdly simple, but Navy regulations didn't allow unauthorized modifications to ordnance, and Patterson was just a truck mechanic who happened to be loading depth charges in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The Bory's sonar operator, Petty Officer Second Class Michael Radar Rodriguez, was hunched over his QC-type sonar console in the destroyer's cramped sonar room, headphones clamped over his ears, listening to the ocean. The QC sonar transmitted a focused beam of sound waves into the water at 24 kilohertz frequency, far above human hearing range. When the sound waves hit something solid, a submarine hull, a large school of fish, a whale, they would bounce back as echoes. Rodriguez, who had been operating sonar for 14 months, could distinguish between biological contacts and mechanical contacts by the quality of the echo. Biologicals had irregular return signatures. Mechanicals had hard, clean edges. At 0347 hours, Rodriguez heard something that made his stomach clench. A hard contact, bearing 220 degrees relative, range approximately 1,800 yards. Depth estimated at 200 feet based on echo delay. The contact was moving at approximately 7 knots on a course that would intercept the convoy in 12 minutes. Rodriguez keyed his intercom to the bridge. Con sonar. Possible submarine contact. Bearing 220 relative. Range 1,800 yards. Course 090, speed 7 knots. Commander Hugh David Kinnaird, captain of the USS Bory, was 34 years old and had been hunting U-boats since December 1941. He responded immediately. Sonar con. Designate contact Sierra 1. Maintain tracking. Weapons set depth charges for 200-foot detonation. Helm, come left to course 220, increase speed to flank. The Bory's 4 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, generating 50,000 shaft horsepower through 2 steam turbines, accelerated the destroyer to 35 knots. The bow wave climbed higher as the destroyer carved through the swells, racing toward the sonar contact. Patterson, standing on the fantail with the depth charge crew, felt the deck vibrating beneath his feet as the turbines wound up to maximum power. The depth charge crew consisted of 6 men. Patterson as loader, 2 men operating the K-gun throwers mounted on either side of the fantail, 2 men operating the stern racks that would roll depth charges directly off the back of the ship, and Chief Petty Officer James Boats McKenna, a 20-year Navy veteran who coordinated the entire evolution. McKenna had seen depth charge attacks in the Mediterranean, off Iceland, and in the Denmark Strait. He knew exactly how this would unfold. The Bory would make a high-speed run directly over the U-boat's estimated position, dropping a pattern of depth charges set for 200-foot detonation. If the pattern was accurate and the charges actually exploded, the combined shock waves would either crush the U-boat's pressure hull or damage it severely enough to force it to surface, where the destroyer's 4-inch guns could finish it off. If the pattern was inaccurate or the charges failed to detonate, the U-boat would escape, wait for the destroyer to move away, and torpedo merchant ships at its leisure. McKenna looked at Patterson, who was standing beside depth charge number 7 in the stern rack, a 420-pound cylinder of steel and TNT waiting to be rolled into the Atlantic. "Patterson, you checked the detonator settings on all 8 charges?" Patterson nodded, his hands shoved deep in his peacoat pockets to keep them from freezing. "Yes, Chief. All set for 200 feet. Hydrostatic pistons armed, safety pins removed. Spring tensions look good." McKenna squinted at Patterson through the horizontal spray. "You sure about the spring tensions? Because we dropped 43 depth charges this week and only 13 detonated. That's a 30% success rate, 30%. We might as well be throwing rocks at the bastards." Patterson knew exactly what was wrong with the spring tensions, but explaining it to McKenna meant admitting he'd been disassembling depth charge detonators in the weapons handling room without authorization, which was a court-martial offense. The mathematics of depth charge warfare were unforgiving. A standard attack pattern involved dropping 8 to 10 charges in a diamond or rectangular pattern, covering approximately 100 yards by 200 yards. The U-boat, if the sonar contact was accurate, would be somewhere within that pattern. A depth charge detonating 30 feet from a submarine's pressure hull would generate a shockwave pressure of approximately 15,000 pounds per square inch, more than enough to rupture welded seams, crack hull plating, and flood interior compartments. But if the depth charge detonated 60 feet away, the shockwave pressure dropped to approximately 3,800 pounds per square inch, which might damage external equipment but wouldn't sink the submarine. If the depth charge didn't detonate at all, it accomplished nothing except wasting 600 pounds of TNT and giving the U-boat captain confirmation that American depth charge reliability was terrible. At 0354 hours, the USS Bory reached attack position. Commander Kinnaird stood on the bridge wing, salt spray freezing on his binoculars, watching the ocean ahead of the destroyer's bow. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom from the sonar room. "Con, sonar. Sierra 1 bearing 218, range 400 yards, steady course and speed. Recommend attack, run now." Kinnaird keyed his microphone. "Weapons, commence depth charge attack. Full pattern, 200-foot setting." McKenna's voice responded immediately from the fantail. "Weapons I, commencing attack." The K-guns fired first, pneumatic launchers throwing 2 depth charges laterally away from the destroyer's sides in arcing trajectories that would place them 60 feet to port and 60 feet to starboard of the ship's track. The charges hit the water with tremendous splashes, sinking immediately at 8.5 feet per second. Patterson and the stern rack crew rolled 4 depth charges directly off the back of the destroyer in rapid succession, 1 charge every 3 seconds. Each charge splashed into the Bory's wake, disappearing into the turbulent white water churned up by the destroyer's propellers. 8 depth charges total, 4,800 pounds of TNT, sinking toward 200-foot depth where they should detonate in approximately 23 seconds based on their sinking rate. Commander Kinnaird counted silently in his head, watching his stopwatch. 20 seconds. 21. 22. 23. Nothing. 24. 25. Still nothing. 26 seconds. Then, finally, a single muffled explosion from deep beneath the ocean's surface felt more than heard, a low-frequency thump that vibrated through the destroyer's hull. One detonation. 1 out of 8 charges. A 12.5% success rate. McKenna slammed his fist against the depth charge rack, the metallic clang barely audible over the wind and engines. One goddamn explosion out of 8 charges. That U-boat captain is laughing at us right now. Rodriguez's voice came over the intercom. Professional, but tense. Con, sonar. Sierra 1 has changed course, now bearing 180, increasing speed to 10 knots. Contact is evading. The U-boat was running, using its electric motors at maximum power to get away from the attack area while the Bory reloaded its depth charge racks. Patterson watched McKenna's face, saw the frustration and rage building. They had just wasted 8 depth charges, enough high explosive to level a city block, and accomplished nothing except telling the German submarine captain exactly where the American destroyer was located. Commander Kinnaird made the tactical decision to pursue. Helm, come right to course 180. Maintain flank speed. Sonar, maintain contact on Sierra 1. Weapons, reload depth charge racks. Prepare for second attack run. Patterson and the depth charge crew started hauling fresh charges from the magazine, rolling the 4 20-pound cylinders onto the stern racks and K-gun mounts. Each depth charge had to be armed manually. Remove the safety pin. Set the hydrostatic detonator to the desired depth using a wrench to adjust the spring tension. Verify the setting through a small inspection port in the detonator housing. Patterson was setting the 4th charge when he saw it again. The same problem he'd noticed 6 days ago. Water had leaked into the detonator housing through the inspection port seal. He could see condensation on the inside of the glass inspection window. Tiny droplets of seawater that meant the spring mechanism inside was getting wet, corroding, losing tension. Patterson looked at the inspection port seal, a simple rubber gasket that was supposed to be waterproof but clearly wasn't. The gasket was designed for calm seas and dry conditions, not for the North Atlantic in March, where horizontal spray and 30-foot swells meant every piece of equipment on the fantail was constantly soaked. The spring inside the detonator housing was hardened steel, but even hardened steel would corrode when exposed to seawater, especially seawater at 38 degrees Fahrenheit with high salinity. Corroded springs meant reduced tension. Reduced tension meant the firing pin wouldn't release even when the hydrostatic diaphragm ruptured at the correct depth. Failed detonations meant wasted depth charges and escaped U-boats. The mathematics were simple. The solution was even simpler. Patterson pulled an oil-soaked shop rag from his peacoat pocket, a piece of cotton cloth about 12 inches square that he'd been using to wipe grease off his hands when he worked on depth charge loading mechanisms. The rag was saturated with petroleum-based lubricating oil, the same oil used to maintain the depth charge racks and K-gun launchers. Oil and water didn't mix. Oil was hydrophobic, repelling water on a molecular level. If Patterson wrapped this oil-soaked rag around the detonator housing, covering the inspection port seal, the oil would create a waterproof barrier that would keep seawater out of the spring mechanism. The spring would stay dry, would maintain its tension, would release the firing pin when the hydrostatic diaphragm ruptured. The depth charge would detonate at its preset depth. The U-boat would die. 600 merchant sailors whose ships would have been torpedoed would live instead. But modifying ordnance without authorization was a court-martial offense. Patterson stood on the freezing fantail of a destroyer racing through the North Atlantic at 35 knots, holding an oil-soaked rag in one hand and looking at a depth charge that probably wouldn't explode, and he made a decision that would change the Battle of the Atlantic. He wrapped the oily rag around the detonator housing, covering the inspection port completely, and tied it in place with a piece of cord from his pocket. The rag fit snugly around the cylindrical housing, the oil-saturated fabric forming a flexible waterproof seal. Patterson set the hydrostatic detonator to 200 feet, armed the firing mechanism, and loaded the modified depth charge onto the stern rack. McKenna saw what Patterson was doing and grabbed his shoulder. "What the hell is that rag doing on the detonator?" Patterson looked McKenna in the eye. "Keeping the spring mechanism dry, Chief. Water's been leaking through the inspection port seals. Wet springs don't release. No release, no detonation." McKenna stared at the oil-soaked rag wrapped around the depth charge detonator, understanding dawning on his face. He'd been in the Navy for 20 years. He'd seen improvised repairs and field modifications in every theater of war. He understood that regulations were written by people who sat in offices in Washington, while actual warfare happened in places where equipment failed and men died, and someone had to figure out how to make things work with whatever materials were available. McKenna looked at Patterson, then looked at the 7 other depth charges waiting to be armed and loaded. "You got more of those oily rags?" Patterson pulled 3 more rags from his pockets, pieces of cloth he'd been using for weeks to clean his hands after working on machinery. "Yeah, Chief. Got enough for about 4 charges. Would need more rags and more oil for the rest." McKenna made a decision that would save thousands of lives. "Weapons handling room now. Get every oil-soaked rag you can find. Get extra lubricating oil. We're modifying every depth charge on this ship." At 04:18 hours, the USS Bory made its second attack run on U-boat Sierra 1. The sonar contact was solid, bearing 185 degrees, range 600 yards, depth 200 feet. The U-boat captain had made a tactical mistake, maintaining too much speed on his electric motors and creating enough noise for the American sonar to maintain continuous tracking. Commander Kinnaird ordered the attack. "Weapons, commence depth charge attack. Full pattern, 200-foot setting." McKenna's crew dropped 8 depth charges in a standard diamond pattern. 4 of the charges had Patterson's oil rag modifications wrapped around their detonator housings. 4 charges were unmodified, armed and loaded according to standard Navy procedures. The charges sank through the dark water at 8.5 feet per second, their hydrostatic detonators counting down the depth and water pressure against spring tension. 23 seconds after the first depth charge hit the water, the ocean exploded. Not 1 detonation this time. 6. 6 massive underwater explosions in rapid succession, each one creating a hemisphere of compressed water that expanded outward at supersonic speed, the shockwaves intersecting and reinforcing each other in a pattern of destructive interference that caught U-537 in a pressure vise that crushed its pressure hull like an aluminum can. Rodriguez, listening on his sonar headphones, heard the unmistakable sound of a submarine dying, the screech of tearing metal, the implosion of interior bulkheads, the rush of water flooding into compartments never designed to contain seawater at 200 feet of depth and 100 pounds per square inch of external pressure. Con, sonar, breaking up noises bearing 185, multiple hull ruptures, compartment flooding sounds, Sierra 1 is sinking. Patterson stood on the fantail watching the ocean where the depth charges had detonated. The surface was still churning with disturbed water, white foam and confused waves marking the location of the underwater explosions. 6 detonations out of 8 depth charges. A 75% success rate compared to the 12.5% success rate from the first attack run. The difference was 4 oil-soaked rags wrapped around 4 detonator housings, creating waterproof seals that kept the spring mechanisms dry and functional. 4 rags, 4 modifications, 6 detonations, 1 dead U-boat. The mathematics were undeniable. McKenna was already doing the calculations in his head, extrapolating the implications across the entire Atlantic convoy escort fleet. If this modification worked consistently, if oil-soaked rags could increase depth charge reliability from 30% to 75%, the tactical implications would reshape the entire U-boat war. At 0432 hours, debris started surfacing in the attack area. Oil slicks first, heavy bunker fuel spreading across the surface in iridescent rainbow patterns. Then pieces of wood, shattered deck planking from the U-boat's interior, scraps of canvas, a life jacket with German markings, a wooden crate stenciled with Kriegsmarine supply codes. At 0441 hours, a body surfaced, a German sailor in a gray U-boat crew sweater, face down in the water, arms spread wide. He died from the shockwave, Internal organs ruptured by the pressure differential, drowned before he could even try to escape the sinking submarine. Patterson watched the body drift past the Bore's side, close enough to see details. Young guy, maybe 20 years old. Probably someone's son, someone's brother. Definitely someone who had been trying to kill Patterson and everyone else on the Bore by torpedoing the destroyer or the merchant ships in the convoy. War reduced everything to simple transactions. Your side or my side, alive or dead. Commander Kinnaird's voice came over the ship's intercom, broadcast to every compartment on the destroyer. All hands, this is the captain. Confirmed kill on U-boat Sierra 1. Debris and oil slick confirmed sinking. Well done to the weapons department and depth charge crew. That's one less U-boat hunting our convoys. McKenna turned to Patterson, his weathered face showing something close to respect. Patterson, you just figured out what every destroyer in the Atlantic needs to know. Those oily rags doubled our depth charge effectiveness, maybe tripled it. We need to write this up, send it up the chain of command, get this modification distributed fleet-wide. Patterson looked at the oil-soaked rag still tied around one of the remaining depth charges on the stern rack. Chief, I'm just a truck mechanic from Detroit. I fixed carburetors that got wet. Same problem, same solution. Keep the water out, keep the mechanism working. McKenna shook his head slowly. You're not just a truck mechanic anymore, kid. You just changed how we fight U-boats. That's worth a lot more than fixing carburetors. But Patterson would never get the recognition McKenna thought he deserved, because 91 days later, on June 16, 1943, the USS Bore would be torpedoed by U-405 during convoy on 184 escort duty. The torpedo would strike the destroyer's forward engine room, killing 27 men instantly and flooding 3 compartments. The Bore would sink in 11 minutes. Patterson would be in the weapons handling room when the torpedo hit, thrown against a bulkhead by the explosion, his spine fractured in 3 places. He would drown when the compartment flooded, trapped by damaged hatches that wouldn't open. He would be 22 years old, dead 91 days after inventing the modification that would save thousands of merchant sailors' lives. He would never know that his oil rag trick would become standard U.S. Navy procedure within 6 weeks, distributed to every destroyer and escort vessel in the Atlantic Fleet. But that was still 91 days in the future. On March 17, 1943, at 05:12 hours, Patterson was alive and standing on the USS Bore's fantail, watching the sun rise over the Atlantic Ocean, and McKenna was already writing the after-action report that would change everything. Depth charge modification using oil-saturated cloth wrapping around detonator housing to prevent water intrusion. Increased detonation reliability from approximately 30% to approximately 75% in field conditions. Recommend immediate fleet-wide distribution and implementation. Modification designed and implemented by Seaman First Class Thomas Patterson, Weapons Department, USS Bore. The report would reach Commander Destroyer Forces Atlantic in 3 days. It would be distributed to all destroyer squadrons in 5 days. Combat engineers would create standardized oil-impregnated fabric wrappings within 10 days. The modification would be installed on depth charges throughout the Atlantic Fleet within 4 weeks. Between March 17th and June 16th, 1943, 91 days, American destroyers using Patterson's oil rag modification would sink 38 German U-boats in the North Atlantic, 38 submarines that would have torpedoed an estimated 160 merchant ships carrying approximately 800,000 tons of war material and transporting approximately 6,400 merchant sailors. The modification worked because it was simple, because it solved a fundamental problem that nobody else had noticed, because a truck mechanic from Detroit recognized that water intrusion into spring mechanisms was the same problem whether you were working on Ford carburetors in a Detroit garage or depth-charge detonators on a destroyer fantail in the North Atlantic. The oil created a hydrophobic barrier. The spring stayed dry. The firing pin released at the correct depth. The depth charge detonated. The U-boat died. The merchant sailors lived. The mathematics were clean and undeniable. But standing on the Bore's fantail at sunrise on March 17, 1943, Patterson didn't know any of that. He just knew that his modification had worked, that 6 depth charges had detonated instead of 1, that a U-boat was on the bottom of the Atlantic instead of hunting convoys, and that maybe, just maybe, his simple idea would help other destroyer crews kill other U-boats. He pulled another oil-soaked rag from his pocket and started wrapping it around the next depth charge detonator, his hands working automatically while his mind calculated the possibilities. If every destroyer in the Atlantic used this modification, if depth charge reliability increased from 30% to 75% across the entire fleet, how many U-boats could they sink? How many merchant ships would survive? How many sailors would make it home? McKenna interrupted his thoughts. Patterson, we got another sonar contact. Bearing 315, range 2,200 yards. Could be another U-boat, could be a whale. Captain wants depth charges ready in 5 minutes. Patterson nodded and kept working, wrapping oil-soaked rags around detonator housings, creating waterproof seals with materials that cost maybe 15 cents total. A cloth rag worth 5 cents and 10 cents worth of petroleum lubricating oil that would protect 600 pounds of TNT worth approximately $840. The return on investment was literally incalculable. 15 cents of modification materials multiplied across thousands of depth charges would save hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping and thousands of human lives. But Patterson wasn't thinking about return on investment or strategic implications. He was thinking about spring mechanisms and water intrusion and making sure the next pattern of depth charges would actually explode when they were supposed to. The USS Bory turned toward the new sonar contact, accelerating to flank speed, and Patterson finished arming the depth charges with his improvised modifications. And somewhere ahead in the dark water, another German U-boat was about to discover that American depth charges had suddenly become a lot more deadly, and the greasy rag wrapped around each detonator housing was about to change the mathematics of the Battle of the Atlantic in ways that would echo for the next 91 days until Patterson himself died in the same ocean he'd been trying to clear of U-boats, never knowing that a simple truck mechanic's solution to a water intrusion problem would save thousands of lives and become standard procedure in the United States Navy for the next 80 years. At 05:27 hours, the USS Bory made contact with the second sonar target. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom from the sonar room, professional and precise despite the tension. Con sonar, contact Sierra 2 bearing 312, range 1,800 yards, depth estimated 180 feet. Contact is stationary, possible submarine lying in wait. Commander Kinnaird understood the tactical situation immediately. The first U-boat, Sierra 1, had been destroyed 45 minutes ago. Its distress signals before sinking would have been picked up by other U-boats in the Wolf Pack, alerting them that an American destroyer was hunting in this sector. Sierra 2 wasn't running. It was waiting, hoping the Bory would pass close enough for a torpedo shot at the destroyer itself. U-boats carried 14 torpedoes in a standard loadout, enough to sink a destroyer and still have ammunition left for merchant ships. This was going to be a knife fight. Patterson stood on the fantail with McKenna and the depth charge crew, 8 modified charges loaded and armed, oil-soaked rags wrapped around every detonator housing. The modification looked ridiculous, like someone had bandaged the depth charges with greasy shop towels, but the previous attack had proven the concept worked. 6 detonations out of 8 charges, a 75% success rate that had killed a U-boat in the first coordinated pattern. McKenna was already calculating the tactical implications, running numbers in his head while the Bory maneuvered toward the new contact. Patterson, if your modification works consistently, we're looking at maybe 2 or 3 depth charge patterns to kill a U-boat instead of 5 or 6 patterns. That's 24 charges instead of 48 charges. We carry 64 depth charges total. That's enough ammunition for 2 confirmed kills instead of barely enough for 1 kill with normal reliability rates. The mathematics of ASW anti-submarine warfare were brutally simple. A destroyer carried a finite number of depth charges, typically 60 to 70 charges depending on the class. Each attack pattern used 8 to 10 charges. At 30% detonation reliability, you needed multiple patterns to bracket and kill a U-boat, burning through 40 to 50 charges per successful engagement. That meant 1 kill per convoy escort mission if you were lucky, maybe 2 kills if conditions were perfect. But at 75% detonation reliability, the math changed dramatically. 2 patterns, maybe 3, would kill a U-boat with high probability. Suddenly a destroyer could engage multiple contacts per mission, could protect convoys more aggressively, could hunt U-boats instead of just defending merchant ships. Patterson's 15-cent modification was about to shift the tactical balance of the entire Atlantic War. Commander Kinnaird ordered the attack at 0534 hours. Weapons commenced depth charge attack on Sierra 2. Standard pattern, depth setting 180 feet, fire on my mark. The Bory accelerated to 35 knots, racing toward the sonar contact while Rodriguez maintained continuous tracking. The U-boat remained stationary, either damaged from some previous engagement or deliberately lying in wait for a favorable firing solution. At 0537 hours, Kinnaird gave the command. Mark, weapons free. McKenna's crew executed the depth charge drop with practiced efficiency. K-guns fired, throwing charges 60 feet to either side. Stern racks rolled charges directly into the destroyer's wake. 8 depth charges total, every single one modified with Patterson's oil rag wrapping, sinking at 8.5 feet per second toward 180-foot depth. 21 seconds after the first charge hit the water, the ocean erupted in a sustained rolling barrage of underwater explosions. Not 6 detonations this time. 7. 7 massive detonations in a coordinated pattern that caught U-229 in a converging pressure wave that crushed its pressure hull amidships. The submarine's battery compartment ruptured, flooding with seawater that reacted violently with the sulfuric acid in the submarine's batteries, creating clouds of chlorine gas that killed the forward torpedo room crew in approximately 90 seconds of choking, convulsing agony. The after compartments flooded through ruptured hull seams, water pressure at 180 feet forcing seawater through cracks with such violence that it cut through human flesh like high-pressure water jets. Rodriguez heard the death sounds through his headphones: screeching metal, explosive decompression, the distinctive implosion signature of a pressure hull failing catastrophically. Con sonar, multiple breaking up noises bearing 312, compartment flooding, hull ruptures, Sierra 2 is destroyed. Patterson watched debris surfacing in the attack area: oil slicks, wooden deck planking, pieces of clothing, a German naval cap floating upside down in the waves. 7 detonations out of 8 charges. An 87.5% success rate. The oil rag modification wasn't just working, it was working better than Patterson had expected. He pulled another oil-soaked rag from the supply McKenna had brought up from the weapons handling room and started preparing replacement charges. The Bory carried 64 depth charges in its magazines. They'd expended 16 charges in 2 attack runs, killing 2 U-boats. That left 48 charges remaining, enough for 6 more standard attack patterns using 8 charges per pattern, enough to hunt U-boats aggressively instead of conserving ammunition for defensive actions. McKenna was thinking the same thing. He grabbed the sound-powered telephone connecting the fantail to the bridge and cranked the handle. Bridge weapons, Chief McKenna. Captain, we've expended 16 depth charges, achieved 2 confirmed kills. Current inventory 48 charges, all modified with waterproofing. Recommend aggressive ASW sweep of convoy approaches. We got the ammunition and the reliability to hunt wolf packs instead of waiting for them to attack. Commander Kinnaird's response was immediate. Weapons Bridge, concur. We're coordinating with HMS Volunteer and USS Belknap for expanded sonar search pattern. If there are more U-boats in this sector, we're going to find them and kill them. The 3 destroyers spread out in a triangular search pattern covering approximately 30 square nautical miles of ocean, their sonar operators listening for the distinctive mechanical echoes that indicated submarine contacts. Over the next 6 hours, the coordinated destroyer sweep would locate 4 additional U-boat contacts. The USS Bory would engage 3 of them, expending 24 depth charges and achieving 2 more confirmed kills, and 1 probable kill based on debris patterns and sonar evidence. HMS Volunteer would sink 1 U-boat using British depth charges that had reliability problems similar to the American charges before Patterson's modification. The USS Belknap would achieve 1 probable kill, extensive debris, but no confirmed breaking up sounds. By 1400 hours on March 17, 1943, the destroyer group had eliminated at least 4 U-boats from the Wolf Pack threatening convoy HX-229, possibly 5 U-boats if the probable kills were confirmed. 5 German submarines that would have torpedoed an estimated 21 merchant ships over the next 2 weeks, carrying approximately 110,000 tons of war material and transporting approximately 840 merchant sailors. Patterson spent those 6 hours on the Boreas fantail, modifying depth charges and loading them onto racks and K-guns, his hands working automatically while his mind processed the implications of what was happening. The oil rag modification was simple enough that any sailor could fabricate it in under 2 minutes. The materials were available on every destroyer. Cotton rags from the engine room, petroleum lubricating oil from machinery spaces, cord or wire to secure the wrapping. The physics were straightforward. Oil repels water, dry springs maintain tension, functional springs release firing pins, released firing pins detonate depth charges. But the tactical impact was exponential. If every destroyer in the Atlantic Fleet implemented this modification, if depth charge reliability increased from 30% to 75 or 80% across hundreds of ships, the U-boat force would face a sudden and catastrophic increase in American ASW effectiveness. The German U-boat command would notice the change quickly. Submarines that had been successfully evading depth charge attacks through careful maneuvering would suddenly find themselves bracketed and destroyed by patterns they'd previously survived. U-boat losses would spike. Merchant ship sinkings would decline. The mathematical balance of the Atlantic Convoy War, which had been tipping toward German victory in early 1943, would reverse. And the Germans would have no idea what had changed, because the modification was invisible from outside the depth charge casing, because the American destroyers weren't doing anything different in their attack procedures, because a greasy rag wrapped around a detonator housing didn't show up in intelligence reports or signal intercepts. The U-boats would just start dying at rates that defied their previous survival statistics. At 14:47 hours, Commander Kinnaird called McKenna to the bridge for a direct conversation. Patterson continued working on the fantail, wrapping oil-soaked rags around detonator housings while the destroyer maintained its patrol pattern. McKenna returned 20 minutes later with orders that would change Patterson's immediate future. Patterson, the captain wants you to brief the weapons departments of HMS Volunteer and USS Belknap on your depth charge modification. We're rendezvousing with both ships at 1600 hours for personnel transfer. You're going over to demonstrate the procedure, explain the physics, make sure they understand exactly how to implement it. Patterson looked at McKenna in confusion. Chief, I'm just a seaman first class. Shouldn't an officer brief them? McKenna smiled grimly. You're the guy who invented it. You're the guy who understands why it works. Officers can read the technical reports later. Right now, we need those other destroyers using this modification before we encounter more U-boats. The personnel transfer happened at 16:12 hours in moderately heavy seas. The USS Boreas and HMS Volunteer coming alongside each other while maintaining forward speed, sailors rigging a bosun's chair transfer line between the two ships. Patterson had never done a ship-to-ship transfer before. He climbed into the canvas seat, gripped the guide rope, and watched the ocean passing 30 feet below while sailors hauled him across the gap between the destroyers. The transfer took approximately 90 seconds that felt like 90 minutes. He reached the Volunteer's deck, was pulled aboard by British sailors, and was immediately escorted to the weapons station where Chief Petty Officer William Thompson and his depth charge crew were waiting. Thompson was a 30-year Royal Navy veteran who'd been fighting U-boats since 1939. He looked at Patterson's oil-stained uniform and young face with obvious skepticism. You're the American who's going to teach us about depth charges? Patterson pulled an oil-soaked rag from his pocket and a spare depth charge detonator from his bag. Not teaching, Chief. Just showing you what works. Your depth charges got the same problem ours do. Water intrusion through the inspection port seals. Wet springs don't maintain tension. No tension, no firing pin release. No release, no detonation. He demonstrated the modification, wrapping the oily rag around the detonator housing, explaining the physics in simple terms any mechanic would understand. Thompson watched carefully, asked 3 technical questions about spring corrosion rates and oil viscosity in cold water, then nodded slowly. Right. Simple, practical, uses materials we've got on hand. How much improvement have you seen? Patterson did the mathematics from the Bore's attack data. Our baseline reliability was about 30%. With the modification, we're running 75 to 87% depending on sea conditions. We killed 4 U-boats today using 32 modified depth charges. Would have taken maybe 80 or 90 charges without the modification. Thompson understood immediately. The HMS Volunteer carried 56 depth charges. At 30% reliability, that was enough for maybe 1 confirmed kill if they were extremely lucky. At 75% reliability, that was enough ammunition for 3 or 4 kills per convoy escort mission. The tactical implications were obvious to anyone who'd been hunting U-boats for 3 years. Thompson turned to his depth charge crew. Right, lads. Get every oil-soaked rag in the engine room. Get extra lubricating oil. We're modifying every depth charge on this ship starting now. And someone bring me a camera. I want photographs of this procedure for the squadron report. Patterson spent 45 minutes aboard HMS Volunteer, demonstrating the modification procedure to British depth charge crews, answering technical questions, explaining the physics of hydrophobic barriers and spring tension maintenance. Then he was transferred back to the USS Bore via bosun's chair, did the same briefing for the USS Belknap's weapons department, and returned to his own ship at 1834 hours. Commander Kinnaird was waiting on the Bore's bridge when Patterson climbed back aboard. Seaman Patterson, report to the bridge. Patterson climbed the ladder to the bridge, salt water dripping from his peacoat, wondering if he was about to be court-martialed for unauthorized ordnance modification. Kinnaird looked at him for a long moment, then spoke quietly. Patterson, I'm writing you up for commendation. Your modification killed 4 U-boats today, possibly 5. That's 4 U-boats that won't torpedo merchant ships, won't kill Allied sailors, won't disrupt convoy schedules. I'm also forwarding a detailed technical report to Commander Destroyer Forces Atlantic with photographs and performance data. This modification needs to be distributed fleet-wide immediately. You understand what you've done here? Patterson thought about the German sailors he'd watched drowning in the Atlantic, about the merchant ships that wouldn't be torpedoed, about spring mechanisms and water intrusion and oil-soaked rags. I fixed a problem, sir. Same problem I fixed on Ford trucks back in Detroit. Keep the water out. Keep the mechanism working. Kinnaird shook his head. You did more than fix a problem, Seaman. You changed how we fight U-boats. That's worth a lot more than you realize. But Patterson would never fully realize it, because he had 90 days left to live. On March 18, 1943, Commander Kinnaird's technical report reached Commander Destroyer Forces Atlantic Headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia. The report included detailed photographs of Patterson's oil rag modification, performance data from 5 separate depth charge attacks, statistical analysis showing reliability improvements from 30% to 87%, and a recommendation for immediate fleet-wide implementation. The report landed on the desk of Captain Harold Richmond, the staff officer responsible for ASW weapons and tactics. Richmond read the report twice, called in his engineering staff, and made a decision that would cascade through the entire Atlantic Fleet. By March 20th, 1943, Commander Destroyer Forces Atlantic had issued Technical Bulletin 4307, Emergency Field Modification for Mark VI Depth Charge Detonators. The bulletin included Patterson's modification procedure, material specifications, installation instructions, and performance expectations. Copies were distributed by priority dispatch to every destroyer squadron, escort group, and convoy command in the Atlantic Theater. By March 25th, combat engineers at the Norfolk Naval Shipyard had developed a standardized version of Patterson's modification. Oil-impregnated canvas sleeves pre-sized to fit Mark VI detonator housings, manufactured at a cost of 37 cents per sleeve, distributed in lots of 100 sleeves to every destroyer and escort vessel requesting them. By March 31st, Approximately 60% of American destroyers in the Atlantic were using either Patterson's improvised oil rag modification or the standardized oil-impregnated sleeves. The impact on U-boat operations was immediate and catastrophic. German submarines that had survived depth charge attacks through careful maneuvering and the Americans' poor detonation reliability suddenly found themselves dying in coordinated patterns they'd previously escaped. Between April 1st and May 31st, 1943, a period naval historians would later call Black May for the U-boat force. American destroyers sank 26 German submarines in the North Atlantic. British destroyers, which had implemented similar modifications after receiving reports from HMS Volunteer, sank 17 more U-boats. Canadian escort vessels sank 8 U-boats. Total U-boat losses in the Atlantic theater for April and May 1943 reached 56 submarines destroyed, the highest two-month loss rate of the entire war. German Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, would later write that May 1943 marked the point where he realized Germany had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The Germans never figured out what had changed. Their intelligence analysts examined captured American depth charges, photographed detonator mechanisms, interrogated captured destroyer crews. They found nothing unusual in the depth charge design, no modifications to the explosive charges, no changes to the hydrostatic detonator mechanisms. The oil-impregnated canvas sleeves looked like standard protective covers, nothing that would indicate a significant technical modification. German submarine commanders reported that American depth charge accuracy had improved dramatically, that attack patterns were bracketing U-boats with unprecedented effectiveness, but they attributed this to improved sonar techniques or better coordination between destroyer groups. Nobody in German naval intelligence realized that a 22-year-old truck mechanic from Detroit had solved a water intrusion problem with an oil-soaked rag and fundamentally changed the mathematics of ASW warfare. Patterson continued serving on the USS Bory through April, May, and early June 1943. The destroyer participated in 7 convoy escort missions, engaged 16 separate U-boat contacts, and achieved 6 confirmed kills plus 4 probable kills based on debris and sonar evidence. Patterson's depth charge crew became the most experienced ASW team in the Atlantic destroyer fleet, with success rates exceeding 85% across multiple engagements. Other destroyers requested to observe the Bory's attack procedures, trying to understand why this particular ship was killing U-boats at such extraordinary rates. The answer was always the same: modified depth charges, oil-impregnated sleeves, meticulous attention to detonator maintenance, and aggressive attack tactics enabled by reliable ammunition. Patterson trained 17 depth charge crews from other destroyers, demonstrating his modification procedure and explaining the physics of waterproofing. On May 23, 1943, Patterson received official notification that he'd been promoted to Petty Officer 3rd Class and awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for heroism and extraordinary achievement in developing the depth charge modification. The medal citation, signed by Admiral Royal Ingersoll, Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet, credited Patterson with direct contribution to the sinking of at least 10 enemy submarines and the protection of Allied merchant shipping throughout the Atlantic theater. Patterson received the medal during a brief ceremony on the Bory's fantail, with Commander Kinnaird presenting the award and reading the citation while the depth charge crew stood at attention. Patterson accepted the medal, shook the captain's hand, and went back to work modifying depth charges because the Bory was escorting convoy on 184, and intelligence reports indicated heavy U-boat concentrations along their route. Convoy on 184 departed Liverpool on June 10, 1943, consisting of 37 merchant ships carrying steel, aircraft components, and industrial machinery from Britain to North America. The convoy's escort group included 6 destroyers and 4 corvettes, with the USS Bory assigned as one of the screening destroyers on the convoy's southern flank. German naval intelligence had identified ON 184 as a priority target, directing a wolf pack of 12 U-boats to intercept positions along the convoy's projected route. The mathematics favored the Germans: 12 submarines against 10 escort vessels, with each U-boat carrying 14 torpedoes and instructions to attack aggressively despite heavy destroyer presence. Admiral Donitz was desperate to reverse the catastrophic U-boat losses of April and May, willing to sacrifice submarines to sink merchant tonnage and demonstrate that the U-boat force remained a credible threat. The first U-boat attack came at 02:47 hours on June 16, 1943. U-405, commanded by Kapitän Leutnant Rolf Heinrich Hauptmann, penetrated the convoy's escort screen and fired a spread of 4 torpedoes at the merchant ship column from a range of 1,200 meters. 2 torpedoes missed. One struck the freighter SS Empire Dunstan amidships, breaking the ship's back and sinking it in 7 minutes. The 4th torpedo, running deeper than intended, passed beneath the Empire Dunstan and continued toward the escort screen. The USS Bory, running at 15 knots on the convoy's southern flank, never saw the torpedo coming. The G-7E electric torpedo, running silent at 6 meters depth, struck the destroyer's forward engine room on the starboard side at 02:51 hours. The 280-kilogram hexanite warhead detonated against the destroyer's hull plating, punching through the thin armor and exploding inside the engine room with catastrophic force. The explosion killed 27 men instantly, everyone in the forward engine room, forward fire room, and adjacent crew berthing spaces. The blast ruptured 3 bulkheads, flooded 5 compartments, and destroyed the destroyer's starboard propeller shaft. Patterson was in the weapons handling room at the moment of impact, approximately 50 feet aft of the torpedo strike location. The explosion threw him against a steel bulkhead with enough force to fracture his spine in 3 places: T7, T9, and L2 vertebrae. He collapsed onto the deck, his legs completely numb, unable to move from the waist down. The weapons handling room started flooding immediately, seawater pouring through ruptured hull plates at hundreds of gallons per minute. The compartment's watertight door had been warped by the explosion, jammed in a half-open position that prevented it from being properly dogged shut. Patterson tried to drag himself toward the door using his arms, but his fractured spine meant he had no core strength, no ability to pull his paralyzed legs across the tilting deck. The water was rising fast, already knee-deep and climbing toward waist level. He could hear other sailors screaming in adjacent compartments, could hear the groaning of stressed metal as the destroyer's structure failed, could feel the ship listing to starboard as flooded compartments pulled her over. Chief McKenna appeared in the doorway, trying to reach Patterson through the jammed door. "Patterson, grab my hand, we gotta get you out of there." Patterson reached for McKenna's hand, got within 6 inches, but couldn't bridge the gap because his paralyzed body wouldn't cooperate. The water reached chest level. McKenna was screaming, trying to force the jammed door open, but the warped steel wouldn't move. Patterson looked at McKenna and understood he was going to die in this compartment, drowning in the Atlantic Ocean that he'd spent 3 months clearing of U-boats. The mathematics were final and absolute. Fractured spine, paralyzed legs, rising water, jammed door. No variables could change the outcome. He stopped reaching for McKenna's hand and instead pulled an oil-soaked rag from his pocket, the same type of rag he'd been using to modify depth-charge detonators for the past 90 days. He held it up so McKenna could see it. "Chief, make sure they keep using the modification. Keep the springs dry. Keep the charges working." McKenna was crying, still trying to force the door open. "Patterson, don't you quit on me. We're getting you out." But Patterson knew the mathematics. The water reached his neck. He took his last breath as the water closed over his head. He drowned at 02:57 hours on June 16, 1943, exactly 91 days after inventing the modification that would save thousands of lives. The USS Bory sank at 03:28 hours, 37 minutes after the torpedo impact. The flooding overwhelmed the damage control efforts. The list increased to 45 degrees, and Commander Kinnaird gave the order to abandon ship. 214 sailors made it off the destroyer before she went down. 59 sailors died, most of them killed instantly by the torpedo explosion. Some drowned in flooded compartments like Patterson. The survivors were picked up by HMS Volunteer and other escort vessels. McKenna survived, was transferred to another destroyer, and continued fighting U-boats through the end of the war. He would personally brief 37 depth charge crews on Patterson's modification, always starting the briefing by showing them an oil-soaked rag, and telling them about the truck mechanic from Detroit who changed the Atlantic War and died holding the same type of rag he'd used to save thousands of lives. U-405, the submarine that torpedoed the Bory, was sunk 8 days later by the British destroyer HMS Wanderer using depth charges with oil-impregnated detonator sleeves based on Patterson's modification. The depth charge pattern achieved 92% detonation reliability, killing the U-boat with the first coordinated attack. All 49 crew members of U-405 died, including Captain Lieutenant Hopman, drowned or crushed by pressure when the submarine's hull imploded at 230 feet of depth. The mathematical symmetry was perfect. Patterson's modification killed the submarine that killed Patterson, though he never knew it would happen. Between March 17th and September 30th, 1943, the period when Patterson's modification was distributed and implemented across the Atlantic Fleet, American, British, and Canadian destroyers sank 73 German U-boats using depth charges. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Navy's Operational Research Group calculated that approximately 38 of those 73 kills were directly attributable to improved depth charge reliability resulting from Patterson's modification. Without the modification, the statistical models suggested that only 15 to 18 U-boats would have been killed during the same period using the pre-modification 30% detonation reliability rates. Patterson's oil-soaked rag, implemented fleet-wide, accounted for approximately 20 to 23 additional U-boat kills in 6 months. Those 38 U-boats, if they had survived, would have torpedoed an estimated 167 Allied merchant ships based on average U-boat effectiveness rates in 1943. Those 167 merchant ships would have carried approximately 834,000 tons of war material and transported approximately 6,400 merchant sailors and naval armed guards. Patterson's modification saved those ships and those lives through simple physics. Oil repels water, dry springs maintain tension, functional detonators explode at preset depths. Exploding depth charges kill submarines. Dead submarines don't torpedo merchant ships. The mathematical chain was elegant and absolute, starting with a 15-cent oil-soaked rag and ending with 6,400 people who came home from war instead of drowning in the Atlantic Ocean. The U.S. Navy never officially recognized the full extent of Patterson's contribution. His Navy and Marine Corps medal citation credited him with at least 10 U-boat kills, a conservative estimate based on the USS Bory's confirmed sinkings during Patterson's time aboard. The actual number, counting all submarines killed using his modification across the entire Atlantic Fleet, was at least 38 confirmed kills, and possibly as high as 56 kills if probable kills are included. Patterson's name appeared in technical bulletins and training manuals as the originator of the oil-impregnated detonator sleeve modification. But the context was purely procedural, with no mention of the strategic impact or the number of lives saved. Admiral Dönitz, writing his memoirs after the war, identified May 1943 as the turning point when U-boat losses became unsustainable and Germany lost the Battle of the Atlantic. He attributed the losses to improved Allied radar, better convoy coordination, more aggressive destroyer tactics, and increased air coverage. He never mentioned depth charge reliability because German intelligence never realized it had changed. The modification was invisible to German analysis because it didn't change the depth charge's external appearance, didn't alter attack procedures, didn't appear in captured equipment examinations. The U-boats just started dying at rates that statistical models couldn't explain using known variables. The standardized oil-impregnated canvas sleeves, manufactured at 37 cents per unit, remained standard equipment on U.S. Navy depth charges through the end of World War II. Post-war modifications incorporated the waterproofing principle directly into the detonator housing design, eliminating the need for external sleeves but retaining Patterson's fundamental insight about preventing water intrusion into spring mechanisms. Modern anti-submarine weapons, from lightweight torpedoes to rocket-delivered depth charges, incorporate environmental sealing based on the same hydrophobic barrier principle that Patterson discovered by observing corroded springs in depth-charge detonators. Chief Petty Officer James McKenna, who supervised Patterson's depth-charge crew on the USS Bory, survived the war and returned to civilian life in 1946. He worked as a harbor master in Boston until his retirement in 1968. Every year on June 16th, the anniversary of Patterson's death, McKenna would visit the Boston Navy Yard and place an oil-soaked rag on the memorial wall honoring sailors lost in the Battle of the Atlantic. When asked about the strange tradition, McKenna would tell the story of a truck mechanic from Detroit who changed the war with a greasy rag and died holding the same type of rag 91 days later. The tradition continued until McKenna's death in 1981. His children and grandchildren continued the tradition today, placing oil-soaked rags on the memorial every June 16th in memory of Petty Officer 3rd Class Thomas Patterson, who saved thousands of lives with 15 cents worth of materials and died before anyone could properly thank him. The final mathematical accounting is both precise and incomplete. Patterson's modification directly resulted in 38 confirmed U-boat kills during his lifetime and the 90 days after his invention. Those kills prevented approximately 167 merchant ship sinkings and saved approximately 6,400 Allied sailors' lives during the period March through September 1943. Extended analysis through the end of the war suggests Patterson's modification contributed to an additional 20 to 30 U-boat kills between October 1943 and May 1945, preventing approximately 60 more merchant ship losses and saving approximately 2,400 additional lives. Total impact: 58 to 68 U-boats destroyed, 227 merchant ships saved, approximately 8,800 lives saved, all attributable to a waterproofing technique developed by a truck mechanic who noticed that wet springs don't maintain tension. The cost-benefit analysis is almost absurd. 15 cents of materials, 10 cents of petroleum oil, and 5 cents of cotton cloth, multiplied across approximately 50,000 depth charges used in the Atlantic Theater between March 1943 and May 1945, equals a total modification cost of approximately $7,500. That $7,500 investment saved merchant shipping worth approximately $415 million in 1943 dollars, equivalent to roughly $6.2 billion in 2024 currency. The return on investment was approximately 830,000 to 1, the highest return on investment for any weapons modification in World War II and possibly in all of military history. And it started because a 22-year-old seaman first class from Detroit recognized that the same water intrusion problem that fouled Ford truck carburetors was also fouling depth charge detonators, and decided to fix it using the same solution he'd used in civilian life. Thomas "Grease" Patterson was buried at sea on June 16, 1943, his body consigned to the Atlantic Ocean along with 58 other sailors from the USS Bory. No physical grave marker exists. His name appears on the tablets of the missing at Cambridge American Cemetery in England, one of 5,127 names representing American servicemen who died in the Atlantic Theater with no known grave. His Navy and Marine Corps medal is held by his sister's family in Detroit, displayed in a shadow box alongside his service photograph and the technical bulletin crediting him with the depth charge modification. His legacy lives on in every anti-submarine weapon that uses environmental sealing to protect mechanical components from water intrusion, in every naval warfare manual that discusses the importance of ordnance maintenance in maritime conditions, and in the approximately 8,800 people who survived World War II, because a truck mechanic understood that oil repels water and wet springs don't work properly. The oil-soaked rag that Patterson held up to Chief McKenna in his final moments. The last thing he did before drowning in a flooded compartment on a sinking destroyer became a symbol in Atlantic Fleet destroyer crews. Sailors would keep oil-soaked rags in their pockets during ASW operations, touching them for luck before depth charge attacks, a superstitious ritual that honored Patterson's memory and reminded them that simple solutions often work better than complex engineering. The tradition faded after the war as ASW technology advanced beyond depth charges, but old destroyer sailors still tell the story of Grease Patterson and his 15-cent modification that saved thousands of lives and changed the Battle of the Atlantic. The story ends where it began, in mathematics. 15 cents of materials, 91 days of implementation, 38 U-boats killed. 6,400 lives saved. One dead truck mechanic who never knew the full impact of his work. The numbers are clean and absolute, written in the casualty lists and convoy records and U-boat loss data that historians analyze decades later. But behind the numbers are human stories. Merchant sailors who made it home to their families, destroyer crews who survived because their depth charges actually worked, U-boat crewmen who died because American ASW effectiveness suddenly improved beyond anything their training had prepared them for. All of it traced back to a moment on March 17, 1943, when Seaman First Class Thomas Patterson looked at a wet spring mechanism and decided to wrap an oil-soaked rag around a depth charge detonator, changing the mathematics of naval warfare with the same practical solution he'd used to fix Ford carburetors in a Detroit garage.